You're here to see Jonathan Mahler, or hear Jonathan Mahler, who is a master of the moment. As an author and staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, he's known for engrossing historical narratives of New York, as well as his coverage of national politics, law, and media. Mahler's first book, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, subtitled 1977, Baseball, Politics, and the Battle for the Soul of a City, takes us back to the Son of Sam, the battles between Reggie Jackson and Billy Martin, Ed Koch and Mario Cuomo, the opening of Studio 54, and the arrival of punk rock. In that book, we see a New York that is literally on fire. There are landlords burning down their own buildings to collect insurance money, a citywide blackout in sweltering heat with attendant looting, and a city budget teetering on bankruptcy. In his latest book, The Gods of New York, Egotists, Idealists, Opportunists, and the Birth of the Modern City, Mahler shifts to a new moment, the years between 1986 and 1990, in which the city is in one way rising, experiencing rebirth through incredible profits on Wall Street and in real estate, but in another way, it's still a city in trouble with some very big problems. The relatively new phenomenon of homelessness, crack, AIDS, and a long simmering racial tension boiling over in places like Bensonhurst and Howard Beach. And then there's the characters we all know or think we know. Ed Koch, Rudy Giuliani, Al Sharpton, Spike Lee, Larry Kramer, Donald Trump, and others, all of them shaping New York's future while simultaneously becoming legends in themselves. The book is a tapestry of so many threads skillfully woven into a story that in places is very recognizable, but in others, surprisingly fresh with the distance of years and Mahler's nuanced reportage. It was a best book of the year in the Times' book review, The Economist, The New Yorker, and Town and Country, and we are so pleased to have the author here in conversation with us tonight. Please help me welcome Jonathan Mahler. Okay. You don't just flick up? Yeah, grab some water. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Jonathan came in on the train from New York to be with us tonight, and I'm so glad. I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure people do.
I'm here to answer them.
Yeah, good. Well, we're going to get right into it. I think the fulcrum of the book, with its many, many threads, is Ed Koch. Ed Koch, the legendary mayor of New York, who really embodies this story in a way through his own rise and fall and his contradictions and quirks. So when, the book is really asking the question whether New York City can be both this great working class city that has lifted up immigrants from all over the world and at the same time be the moneyed capital of global finance, it kind of makes sense to start with Koch. And I think Koch is a uniquely New York character. New York has always been, to me, very much its own city, an international place within the United States, but not necessarily indicative of the rest of the nation. And yet, I think Koch was really responding to things that were happening nationally. Do you want to just get us going with a little context about, prior to 1986, what that first term of the Reagan presidency between 81 and 85 was kind of doing to Koch and New York City?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Hunter, for helping arrange this, old college friend who I haven't seen in years. I think probably the right place to start is with the kind of 70s, which is sort of what Koch kind of stepped into when New York was most of you have probably been, were around New York in those years. Even if you weren't, you can probably kind of conjure images from movies like, The Warriors or Taxi Driver, of the city that was just really kind of down on its luck, covered in graffiti, as you mentioned in the introduction, broke, or at least kind of always sort of flirting with bankruptcy, and really kind of falling apart. And so, that was kind of the New York that Koch stepped into. And, it had not, of course, always been that way. I mean, in an earlier iteration, the kind of post-World War II era, New York had been the world's great working class city. It was the waterfront was bustling with ships, cargo ships, longshoremen. There were kind of good-paying manufacturing jobs for everyone. That was kind of New York in the 1940s and 50s, but over the course of the 60s and 70s, the economy was sort of hollowed out, like it was in so many other cities around the country and around the world, and the city went broke. And then Koch arrives on the scene, and is elected for the first time in 1978, so that would be his sort of first term, and he kind of does over the course of the next 4-6 years, he does sort of two really remarkable things. I mean, one is he lifts one is sort of more kind of psychic, and one is more practical. On the psychic side, he really lifts the city's spirits in a way that that it desperately needed. I mean, that was the era when the I Love New York logo was created, that icon, the I Heart New York. That was on Koch's watch, and I think he sensed that people really had kind of given up on New York. He was a proud New Yorker. He loved New York, and he wanted to make people feel like they should love New York too. So he really kind of successfully pulled that off. He kind of stoked a new kind of sense of pride in New York, a love of New York. So that was kind of on the more kind of emotional side, but practically, and I think this is what you were alluding to, he had a problem. He had a city that whose economy had kind of been hollowed out, and whose municipal budget had sort of shrunk to nothing, and he needed to address the city's kind of economic fortunes too, and economic failures, and he arrived at the same moment that or a couple of years before, Ronald Reagan, of course, arrives in office in Washington, and and Reagan sort of brought with him a new understanding of economics, of the idea that if you incentivize private investment, the money will trickle down, and you will kind of generate development, generate fortunes. And Koch, who was of course a lifelong Democrat, really kind of leaned into that idea because he needed to do something to get New York back on its feet. So he did things like incentivize real estate developers to build with massive tax breaks, and what happened in the process is the city did bounce back. That there's no question about it, and a new city really kind of took root and kind of grew and rose on the ashes of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. But it was a very different kind of city than New York had experienced before. It was not by any means like the great working class city. There was a real paucity of working class jobs, and it was a very different city than the one that Koch had known growing up in the Bronx himself in the 1930s.
Yeah, so the manufacturing was gone, like those jobs were gone, but I think the really stark thing is the disappearance of all the SROs and the welfare hotels. So with the deregulation comes this, homelessness was new.
It's sort of a remarkable fact, but before the 1970s, there really were no homeless people in New York. I mean, there were bums or vagrants or winos, as they were known, who kind of collected around the Bowery, but you didn't see people just sleeping on the streets, and that really began in the sort of second half of the 1970s, and you can sort of trace the root cause of it to really to two main phenomenon. One was the closure of a lot of state psychiatric hospitals, which at the time were they were both being criticized for their treatment of patients. You may be familiar with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but also the rise of medication of drugs to treat things like schizophrenia also made it possible to treat people on an outpatient basis, or so the thinking went. So a lot of psychiatric hospitals closed, state psychiatric hospitals, and there was no plan for what to do with all the patients who lived there. They just were sort of sent out into the streets. That was one sort of part of the cause of the homelessness crisis. The other really was, as you alluded to, the kind of wholesale destruction/renovation of the single-room occupancy hotels, the SROs, or welfare hotels as they were known, which were really the kind of homes of last resort for poor New Yorkers. And these were people who, they were paying their rent with benefit checks. And you kick those people out of their apartments, and they're going to have nowhere to go. I mean, they can't afford to pay rent. So really it was those sort of two factors that sent people out into the streets initially, and then of course what we've seen since then is just as the cost of living has increased in New York, so has the homelessness population. I mean, the amazing thing is, and this was something that really I found so striking just during my research, was when the homelessness crisis really begins in the late 70s and early 80s, there's a kind of very committed group of activists who kind of come together to do something about it. They're amazing people. I write about them some in the book. But they really felt like, well, this is an urgent crisis that, of course, the city has to solve and will solve. It didn't seem imaginable to them that this was going to become a permanent condition, that New York would just have homeless people as kind of part of the cityscape for decades to come. It just seemed like, well, of course, any kind of humane city is gonna figure this out, and particularly New York, a city that has this kind of strong, sort of democratic socialist tradition, this tradition of sort of taking care of its citizens. It just seemed, of course, New York would figure this out, but needless to say, it hasn't.
And Koch had been a progressive.
Yes. Yeah.
You're talking about this tradition. He was a progressive who really shifted quite a bit to the right. But in any case, the homelessness, reading the book, you really do get the sense of like the domino effect of so many of these problems. They're really deep, they're interconnected, some would say intractable. And the characters in the book are all outsized. I mean, they're big. Koch is sort of the spine, but they're all really big characters, and they're all connected to these problems, either through politics or policing, through activism, law, and culture. And I want to look next at another outsized character, and that's Rudy Giuliani, who, like most of the personalities in the book, really worked the media hard for, to personal benefit. And he worked it as hard as he did his cases as a prosecutor at that time in New York's Southern District. What do you think made Giuliani tick in those years, and what role did he play at that time in the kind of parallel cities that we saw developing and also unraveling?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I spent a lot of time sort of thinking about this because, of course, while I was working on this book, Rudy Giuliani was becoming something very different from what most people imagined him as. It was, I would say, of all the characters in the book, and maybe even Trump, I mean, he's the one who seems to have kind of transformed the most radically. When you think about how I mean, his image was the righteous kind of crusader for justice.
Yeah, the law and order guy.
And then of course America's mayor, and the idea that he would become so kind of morally bankrupt was I felt like, of course, this is something I had to sort of make sense of when I was writing the book. And I think what I kind of came to see was that he was just, what really drove Giuliani always was really kind of a raw ambition. I mean, just a desire and kind of hunger for power. And And I think that took the form during these years when he was in the Southern District, or when he was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, as that took the form of a prosecutor, of the kind of the righteous prosecutor. But it didn't have to. I mean, that was just where he kind of pointed himself during these years. And as you say, he turned this office, which had always been, it was unseemly to draw attention for the U.S. Attorney to draw attention to himself, to have press conferences when he made arrests. Giuliani, completely turned that whole tradition on its head, and would hold press conferences, day after day. Everything he did was worthy of a press conference, was worthy of press releases.
And everybody knew it. Everybody knew his shamelessness, and he did it anyway.
He did. That's right. Yeah. And shamelessness is really the right word for who he was then and who he became. It just has such a different valence now that we've seen, what kind of use he sort of puts it to. But even after the if you remember his kind of great moment as America's mayor after 9/11, which was everyone I think just he was a global hero. He took that capital that he had built as America's mayor and turned it into a multi-million-dollar international security consulting business. So he
Right.
also was and he was greedy as well. I mean, he's someone who's obsessed with power and money is the reality.
Yeah, and really used these cases as a way of positioning
advancing
himself as a figure who could clean up New York in the future. That was his image, the law and order guy who could clean up New York, which is interesting because there was already someone there on the ground sort of dealing with the effects of large-scale homelessness and the cuts to housing and mental health and the crack epidemic, which was really responsible for most of the crime at that time in New York City. And that person with boots on the ground was Benjamin Ward. Benjamin Ward, the city's first African-American police commissioner who was appointed by Koch. And Ward is a sympathetic figure in your book, and there are not many of those. So, he found himself in a tough spot. It's hard not to feel for this guy. It's like he couldn't win.
I mean, it was, as you see, this was the first black police commissioner of New York who was appointed at the very moment that kind of crack arrived in New York, that AIDS arrived in New York, that the homelessness problem became a crisis, and that the city budget was a fraction of what it had been 10 years earlier. So he was just completely kind of overmatched by these circumstances. But he did he certainly did the best he could. And I think one thing that I found sort of especially striking is he's sort of a forgotten figure from everyone else we've talked about. These are big figures,
big names.
but he's sort of forgotten. And in his papers, there was an unpublished memoir that he had written, and it was kind of incredible. It was so candid, and he wrote about the experience of being a black man, a black police commissioner who spends day after day arresting young black men and going up to prisons and seeing them filled with the young black men who he'd put in prison. And he talks about really very candidly about how heartbreaking that was for him, but also how he felt like, he had no choice.
Yeah, let's talk about the black community at this time, because Ward was really caught, between the black and the blue.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
The black community that was really organizing into a movement, and the cops, the New York City police. Let's turn to Sharpton. And when we talk about Al Sharpton, I think we also need to talk about Alton Maddox and Vernon Mason, the two attorneys who were active at this time. I was fascinated in the book, I hadn't remembered this, to learn that they had a new approach. They were actually trying to change the justice system, how it worked. It was at that time perceived to be spectacularly failing Black people, and maybe not just failing them, but actually seeking them out to kind of, victimize them. And they were doing things a little bit differently. Can you explain some of that?
Yeah, sure. Sharpton, he's, one of the characters who I just found most fascinating, I think, partly because he's someone who, if you remember New York a little bit during this era, you can maybe picture him as the guy, 300 pounds and
the
tracksuits,
sweatsuit, the big chain with the
big
metal,
Martin Luther King Jr. medallion.
Yeah.
And he was at the time, he was kind of widely mocked and ridiculed. The sort of tabloids just had like great fun with him day after day. But that was kind of okay with him because he kind of recognized that,
any press is good press.
Yeah, and that and he was kind of a complicated person because he was doing this, drawing so much attention to himself because he loved the attention and he was kind of a narcissist. But he also, really believed in his cause, and it was a very righteous cause, as you say. The criminal justice system was so badly broken, so endemically racist at this moment in New York's history, that it was that it's hard not to sort of sympathize with him, in everything he was trying to do. And what he was trying to do really was make a spectacle of himself and sort of draw attention to his causes. And I think that he was again kind of a bit of a laughing stock in in kind of many parts of the city. But I think he also was building a real following. And you look at where he's come since then, where he's been since then, and he's now a respected, very respected Black leader. He's in the White House. Not in this administration, but historically he's in the White House. And so I think I think another kind of just a sort of a personal anecdote that's sort of amusing is he so I had talked to him a lot during the book. I have I had somewhat of a relationship with him just from my life at the New York Times, but not a close one. And but I interviewed him a lot for the book, and then I didn't talk to him for a while because the book was done. It had to go through fact checking and get published and all that, and I just wasn't sure how he would react to the book. And really, literally, I think it was the very first day after the book was published, maybe the day after publication day, I got an email from him, and it's he said, "Oh, Jonathan, I've read The Gods of New York, and I agree with most of what you wrote. Come meet me at my cigar club, and we'll talk about it." So he also was kind of a gracious person who has a sense of humor about himself. I found I think the portrait of him is nuanced, and I would say is not flattering exactly, but I did find him to be kind of a complicated and fascinating person.
He was an operator for sure back then. More so I think Maddox and Mason were trying.
Yeah. So so these were the two, the sort of the three of them kind of worked together, and they kind of came up with a sort of a strategy. These Maddox and Mason were both lawyers, and the idea was that they would they first did this in the Howard Beach case, but the idea was to take a Black victim of a crime and to urge that victim to withhold cooperation, to force them to withhold cooperation with the authorities, with the police, with the prosecution, to sort of force a change in policy. So for instance, they felt they didn't trust the local Queens DA to prosecute
the case.
Because the local Queens DA had a history of not prosecuting cases that involved Black victims. So they realized that if they could convince their clients to withhold their cooperation, they could sort of force and they did this successfully. They could force the governor, in this instance Mario Cuomo, to appoint an independent prosecutor who they thought would be a more, who would actually sort of vigorously prosecute the case, and that's what they did. So it was a kind of a fascinating strategy.
It was, and they all played their role. Like Sharpton was marching in the streets, marching into places like Howard Beach and Bensonhurst, which were almost uniformly white. So Sharpton was doing his bit. The lawyers were doing their bit, and there's a really interesting, I had forgotten what Spike Lee was like in those days. He was coming off of the success of She's Gotta Have It, and he had just written Do the Right Thing, which was based entirely on Howard Beach, and it was like unapologetic. I mean, there was nothing toned down in Do the Right Thing. The music was Public Enemy. I don't know if any of you remember this, Fight the Power. It was a movement that was building at that time, and they each were rising. But there's a picture of Spike Lee in your book, and he looked so young, and I thought, I was
well, we're
too.
We're all seeing a lot of him now.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's interesting. I thought that you talk about Sharpton kind of marching in these white neighborhoods.
Yeah.
I mean, he did this sort of famously after this black teenager, Yusuf Hawkins, was killed in Bensonhurst. Sharpton just week after week would hold marches through Bensonhurst, completely white Italian neighborhood, and I mean they were the sort of epithets that were sort of shouted at them.
It was horrible, the things they shouted.
But it's interesting. We were talking before about Benjamin Ward, the police commissioner, and Koch, and he and Ward and Koch had a very good relationship. But again, in this memoir, this is in my book, but in this kind of unpublished memoir, Ward talks about how when Koch was trying to persuade Sharpton not to march, don't go into Bensonhurst, don't march. It's just
that was really cringy.
Yeah, it's just going to make you're just going to sort of inflame things further. You're going to sort of pour fuel on the fire. And Ward, as he sort of tells the story, is that he tried to explain to Koch like what like a black kid was murdered out there. Like, where do you expect these people to march? Like that's where they need to march.
Right? Shouldn't it be okay for a black person to walk down the street in Howard Beach?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was heartbreaking. Also marching at this time were the AIDS activists who were quite literally fighting for their lives against a disease that had no cure, no effective treatment. These folks felt that the system was not prioritizing them in any way. Enter Larry Kramer, who was, let's say, extravagantly committed to his cause. I mean, wow, was there anybody who beat up on Koch more than Larry Kramer?
There actually may have been no one. And there was certainly no one who Koch felt as threatened by, partly or largely because, Larry Kramer basically blamed AIDS on Ed Koch, which was not fair, but he wasn't entirely wrong that Koch really did fail to deal with it, take it as seriously as he needed to, at a point at which he actually might have been able to do something about it, set up some infrastructure in the city, which he didn't want to spend the money on.
Does everybody know who Larry Kramer is? The playwright and okay.
Oh, yeah. He's a playwright, screenwriter, turned AIDS activist. Yeah, and so. But
and he wrote a play with Koch in it, right? The Normal Heart.
Yes, he wrote a play where
Koch was the villain.
Yes, and not only the villain, he's the closeted mayor of New York City.
Well, which he really was.
Well, and that was why Kramer was so terrifying to Ed Koch, because Koch was in the closet, and most people did not talk about his sexuality. Koch never talked about his sexuality. It was, he had a beard. Bess Meyerson, who was on the campaign trail with him, a former Miss America, but Larry Kramer was the exception. Larry Kramer told everyone he met, and certainly every reporter he met, that Ed Koch was gay in the closet, that he knew some of his ex-lovers, and was constantly threatening to publicly out Koch, which Koch really lived in fear of. This was a very different moment in our country's political history, that that would have, Koch thought that would have completely destroyed his political career. So I mean, Kramer really sort of tormented him. What's so incredible is that Koch serves 3 terms in office, and he loses. He's running for a 4th term. There are no term limits then, and he loses. And he's preparing to leave Gracie Mansion, and he has this tiny little rent-stabilized apartment that he's kept for all these years. But his friends convince him, you've been mayor of New York City for all these years. You can't move back into your little 1-bedroom apartment. So Koch says, all right, I'll go find a 2-bedroom apartment, and he finds a 2-bedroom apartment, and it turns out to be in Larry Kramer's building.
It's so great. That is so great. Yeah. So Larry Kramer could berate him forever.
And that's what he did. He berated him every time he saw him in the mailroom, every time he saw him in the elevator.
I know. It's like in capital letters, like his rants against Koch were famous. But he beat up on everybody. He beat up on Fauci.
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci. Yeah. So Larry Kramer berated Fauci.
He did. He did. And then, he wrote, really vile things about him in the Village Voice, in an open letter in the Village Voice, in the kind of heat of the AIDS crisis.
And Fauci was so nice to him.
He was. And then they did make up.
They did. Fauci was his personal doctor
he became his
at
personal
the end,
doctor.
his personal physician, which is just amazing. If that can happen, anything's possible. Okay, I have to confess, one of the things that surprised me the most in this book was the sense of Donald Trump in those years. He was playing the same game, right? He was playing the media, the, less than truthful statements all day long to influence negotiations, pressing Koch, really, really putting the screws to him to get sweetheart deals. But here's the thing, it comes off almost as playful. It comes off almost like harmless. I remember those years. We were talking about my first job out of college was as an intern at Spy magazine, which invented the term short-fingered vulgarian for Trump, and just was merciless. Absolutely merciless. But even then, there was a sense of like, he's our New York kind of weirdo, or something.
No, that's right. I think that, I think that my intention was a little bit like to sort of recreate how Trump, how
it was then.
Yeah, and how he felt, what kind of figure he was in that moment. Obviously, writing that with the knowledge of who he would become. So you're reading about his exploits in the '80s through the lens of
But here's the thing, the groundwork was there.
Yeah.
That's what's amazing. See, I did not know. In your book is how I realized that he was, Roy Cohn was there, Roger Stone was there, Giuliani was there, Paul Manafort was there, even Don McGahn was connected to Trump in those days, who would eventually become
First White House
Counsel. And at that time, even at Spy, I never thought of Trump as especially dark, or maybe he was dark, but not connected to the Republican machine in that way, not even serious enough.
There's in my research I went through Wayne Barrett's papers. Wayne Barrett was the Village Voice muckraker who wrote the first biography of Donald Trump in the early 1980s.
So this is before Tony Schwartz writes?
Yes, this was long, long ago. And I got his original book proposal for that book, which was, I think it was in 1981 or something. And he describes Trump in that book, in his proposal, as a fleeting cultural figure. He's like, he's a fascinating
Yes,
figure, but
yes.
he's not going to be around for long. But yeah.
It's pretty, you did
Yeah.
a really good job of doing that, because I was, it really, I kind of had to put it down and really kind of breathe for a minute. Before we go to Q&A, because I really want everybody to get a piece of you here. It's such a terrific book. I want to go back to your previous book. I want to go back to Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, where Rupert Murdoch figures very prominently in that book. This is the time when he buys the New York Post. He sets his sights on New York Magazine, where he does some dirty dealing there. Both of those publications are very, very important in Gods of New York. Remember, there's no Instagram during, 86 to 90. What are your thoughts on James Murdoch's recent acquisition of New York and Vox? So James Murdoch, son of Rupert, who with his siblings got pushed aside so that the chosen son, Lackland, could run Fox and the media empire and kind of maintain Fox in its current incarnation. So James now buys New York, he buys Fox. Is this a new moment? Is this the next book? What are we seeing here?
I've written a lot about the Murdochs. I think
I know. Billions.
I've had my fill. Yeah. But I think no, it's really fascinating. I mean, his father was one of his first big purchases in on American soil was New York Magazine, and James as the son who is left out, and who has different politics from his father and Lachlan, definitely has something to prove. But I think we also might want to be a little wary.
I know. I was going to say, are they different?
Yeah. No, they are.
Are they?
But
they are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, he's a much more kind of moderate and grounded.
Yeah, he went sour on Fox.
He did. Yeah.
When was it? What was it? Was it the voter fraud stuff or the?
It was even earlier. I mean, it was like the Muslim ban was when it sort of started. Yeah.
All right, so let's go to Q&A. We have a microphone here. This is being recorded, so please raise your hand, and our staff person will come to you so that you can speak into the mic.
So I've been to Bulgaria 5 times. I have Bulgarian friends, and I object to them being tarred with the Trumpian brush. And secondly, to the author, did you send a copy of this to Donald Trump, and did he read it and invite you to the Oval Office to discuss it?
It wasn't Bulgarian, it was Vulgarian. Short-fingered Vulgarian.
No, I interviewed in the sort of the kind of origin story of this book is that in 2016, I was at the Times. I'm usually at the magazine, but in 2016, I was like moved to cover the campaign, and so I wrote a bunch of stories about him in 2016, and I he was so accessible. I could call him. You could get him on, as I guess he sort of still is. Get him on the cell phone whenever you wanted to. But as soon as he, once he was in office, he didn't, I tried to talk to him for the book and failed to. However, just a couple weeks ago, Zoran Mamdani at a press conference said that he was reading the book. So at least I got the mayor of New York City reading it. So yeah.
Anybody else? Questions? Got a lot over here. The question is, what did you think of Mayor Dinkins?
Yeah, I mean, I think he got really unlucky. I think he first of all, people credit Giuliani with bringing crime down in New York, which he certainly had a lot to do with. But it started to decline during the Dinkins years, and it was, and a lot of that was really just about the kind of finally the kind of crack epidemic started to recede. And he had, he was also in a kind of a difficult financial moment, Dinkins, and he kind of stepped into, he won very narrowly in 1989, and he stepped into a very racially polarized city. And Giuliani, who had every intention of running again against him, did everything he could to sort of drive that wedge even deeper into the city. So I feel like Dinkins was, has sort of, he had like kind of it was a tough moment, and a tough moment to be the city's first black mayor, a tough moment in terms of the municipal budget. So I feel like he was, I think he was important in the sense that the city did like desperately needed healing in that moment, and he was a kind of the sort of figure that I think was unlike the sort of polar opposite of Koch, who was someone who really leaned into, this is who I am, take it or leave it, love me or hate me.
How am I doing? That was his thing. How am I doing?
Dinkins was much more of a gentleman, and I think he was and much more civil, and I think that was kind of something that New York needed, but I still think he's, he didn't have a like particularly successful term, and I don't think he's, I think he probably was unlucky in many ways.
Well, and like Ward, I think he took a lot of hits also from some in the black community. Because he was always trying to be sort of a mediating voice, a very calm, and he took some hits. More questions? Oh, we have one there.
Crime fell under Giuliani and Braden, not just because the crack epidemic ended, but it fell down to 30-year lows. So is it real change in the way of running the city and crime? Why weren't Koch or Dinkins able to try to do the same thing? Why did they have to wait for Giuliani to have a real change of solving crime in New York?
Yeah, well, I think that, part of it was the budget. I mean, Koch was the city was like, the budget was much smaller when Koch took over, so there were fewer cops. I think crack and AIDS had a lot to do with, that's what spiked crime. And there's no question that policing got, like, because of Bratton, because of Rudy, but really because of Bratton, policing got a lot more intelligent during those years, and then Ray Kelly. And I don't know why did that not happen sooner. I don't know. It's like any kind of technological advancement, any kind of progress. It just it was really. Jack Maple too had a lot to do with it. It was just for whatever reason that was the moment when people like really kind of set their minds to figuring out how to be smarter about policing and.
The broken windows, or the squeegee guys.
Yeah.
Remember outlawing the squeegee?
Yeah,
the squeegee
but even
guys?
beyond that, just in terms of kind of targeting high crime neighborhoods. Ward tried versions of it, but he was just overwhelmed. There was just so much crime. Yeah.
You really get that sense reading this book. It's just coming at you fast and hard from every direction in these years. There was another one.
Yeah, right here.
Okay.
Thanks. Given the media landscape in New York, it's one of the few cities in the world where your hometown newspaper is the national, if not world, newspaper, and all the national TV networks are headquartered and so on. How do you see the media as having been implicated in the rise of some of these larger-than-life figures? It seems like they were complicit. Not always in a bad way, but what's your perspective on the role of the media?
Yeah, the media was what made all of these figures. That all of these, almost everyone in this book recognized that publicity was its own form of power, and that you got publicity by largely via the tabloids during these years.
It's really not the Times. It's
no, and not
it was
in
like
terms
the
of like
Post
the big
and the
New York
Daily
City
News,
stories.
the epic headlines. They're amazing.
Yeah. and I think it's sort of a mixed bag. I mean, I think that on the one hand, the tabloids were were incredibly polarizing themselves. I mean, that's what they do, right? They turn every story into, here's the good guy and here's the bad guy. We're with this one and against that one. They're like comic books, basically. That's what tabloids are. But at the same time, they were bringing the city together around the same storylines. Everyone in New York was talking about everything in this book because they were reading about it in the tabloids. And you had these amazing columnists, Jimmy Breslin, Pete Hamill, others who really kind of captured the sort of spirit and the sort of feel of the city, and I think and the mood of the city in a way that was like incredibly helpful for and like a real positive for the civic fabric of New York. So I don't know. I mean, it's true that yes. That to some degree, I guess the papers are complicit in terms of making these figures as famous as they have become. But I think that's sort of the nature of the media. Yeah. Speaking as a member of the media.
Hello, Donald. I'm curious. First of all, I can't wait to read it because growing up in the Bronx in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it's like a warm hug hearing about some of the horrors that we lived through. But it was, it was just life, right?
Yeah.
And my mother was a school teacher in the Fort Apache, the Bronx area. So my question is also, don't forget, Trump in that era was a clown, but he also threw the, Central Park 5 to the wolves. And
Which is in this
he was,
book
He was
at the very end.
He was always a helpful clown, right?
Yeah.
So just,
Yeah.
right, well, let's not be fooled. But also, Jonathan, was there anything that you started to go down that surprised you, right? Did you start looking at a story and you're like, oh, I don't remember that, or I didn't think that was going to turn out that way as you researched it?
I mean, so many things were not what I expected they would be.
Mm-hmm.
Like Sharpton was a good example. I mean, I
Right.
think I went into this sort of thinking of him as almost comic relief. And then, then I really kind of came to see how, how, first of all, how successful, how even as he was being kind of mocked, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was building an enormous following, and he really was like driven, again by his desire for fame and fortune, and also by like a real cause that someone needed and no one else was addressing. So that, I mean, I also, I felt, we talked a little about homelessness before, but I also was so struck by how homelessness just kind of crept up on the city, and that it was, again, that like it was something that felt so solvable. And it was just kind of amazing to be reading about people who believed that it was something that could be solved. Really just sort of generally, I kept feeling like having the benefit of these years. I mean, it's the thing about writing kind of recent history, I guess, and also the nature of how I work is like because I'm a journalist, I sort of interview as many people as I can. So I interviewed hundreds of people, but I also sort of do the archival research as well. And so, I mean, to sort of have the benefit of all these years, and then to sort of look back on this period of time that people experienced so like viscerally, as you like talk about the Bronx and like during this period, it's so it was all so kind of visceral and real. To now like be able to bring a little bit of like perspective was like it really like just sort of shift the focus and sort of change the lens for me in a way. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Two related questions. I'd be interested to hear your views on Mandami and how much of his social and political agenda you think he'll be able to achieve.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's going to be very difficult for him to achieve much of his social and political agenda. But I think that I think about him. I mean, if you want to put him kind of in the context of this book, I think of him as this sort of period of time that I'm writing about in this book is sort of the beginning of a, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the beginning of a chapter in the life of New York's history. This is sort of the beginning of the great boom, right? The sort of Wall Street and real estate driven boom that begins in the 1980s and kind of follows us well into the 2000s. I kind of think of Mamdani's election as kind of the sort of end of this era and the beginning of another era. And I don't really know what that era is going to bring. And as you think about New York, there's always this incredible tension in the city between the vast sums of wealth that are produced and created and possessed there, and the poverty, and not just the poverty, but the sort of the voices, the advocates for the people, for the less fortunate. I mean, this is the city of Emma Goldman, as well as Donald Trump, and so. I think of him as sort of really very much in the kind of that New York tradition of this tension and of a kind of, I don't know if you'd say like a necessary corrective, but an unsurprising one, given how much, how sort of unequal the wealth creation has become in New York, that it's sort of not surprising that he's there. Having said all that, I think it's going to be very hard for him to make really sort of meaningful change. I mean, the city has an economic structure now that's been built over the course of decades that relies on private industry, that relies on real estate taxes and property value, and it's going to be very hard for him to change that. But I do think that he's already kind of created a sense of awareness about it that might be helpful.
It's crazy.
I also think he's just very. I've found him to be just so kind of charming and likable in a way that sort of very different from Koch, because Koch was as I mentioned earlier, was kind of his polarizing. Part of Koch's charm was that he was sort of polarizing and in your face. Mamdani has a very different kind of charm, but it's been kind of nice to have someone in office who's got some charisma and who's fun to listen to.
That is really, when you were first answering the question, I was going back to Donald Trump, and the thing about this book is he had a lot of charisma in those days. People found him charming, and he had solutions. Like, remember Wallman Rink? Like, all right, you couldn't do it, I'll do it, I'll take care of it. He had
that was also a kind of a Trump scam too.
Yes, it was. But there was, he appealed to people's sense of like positivity about New York or something.
He did, no, totally. And I think one of the reasons, when this kind of goes back to your question about the media, one of the reasons why Trump was so, so popular in New York during these years, and was why the media wrote about him so much, was that the city was so kind of down on its heels in the 70s and into the early 80s, and he was he brought a kind of, and I hate to even talk about him in these terms, but he brought a certain kind of like glamour to New York. He wanted to invest in the city. He was building in the city, and so and also, like, I mean, he was sort of, I mean, even then he was sort of ridiculous with his kind of over the top visions of building, Television City, which became Trump City, this crazy development he wanted to build on the West Side that was going to be, 10 of the tallest skyscrapers in the world, and it was of course never going to happen. But there was I think like an appreciation for the fact that, well, there's at least someone is like wants to invest in the city and has big dreams for New York. And I think that even though people pretty quickly came to see that a lot of it was just like kind of self-aggrandizing hype, it was still like had some kind of a spiritual effect that was, and it was fun to write about. I mean,
I think Mamdani did that for a lot of people. I think Mamdani had that effect. Like, he has big ideas and big dreams and hopes for New York, and was positive. And I mean, I'm not comparing Mamdani to Trump or Trump to Mamdani, but I do think that
they're just a couple boys from Queens.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? Elm Street Books is in the house. We've got piles of books. Jonathan's going to head over there and sign them for us. Thank you so much for coming out to New Canaan.